The whole purpose of being here is peace building, really coming together and being unified in this really important mission and vision. At the same time that we can appreciate how important this work is, we all know that it's really difficult as well. And part of why I am especially excited about introducing the speaker is thinking about my own use of systems theory and how valuable that's been in my own work. My training is as a couple and family therapist as well as a psychologist. And what you see working with couples and families, of course, is that having good intentions doesn't necessarily get you to the finish line, that all of us here doing this work know that we have the good intentions of wanting to build a more peaceful and healthier world, and it isn't quite that easy. And part of what we're going to hear about not only is doing good work, but doing effective work and knowing how our work is effective. I think in particular, thinking about the challenges of this work systemically, first of all, the issues of multi-generational trauma, that those don't go away easily, that these are really challenging and very complex problems to solve. And excuse me, at the same time, so systems theory really helps us think about multi-generational issues, but also helps us think about issues of causality in complex ways. It's so easy to finger point and blame and to kind of try to simplify problems, and simplifying problems may make us feel better, but that often does not help us solve the problems. And so I have a feeling that we're going to hear more about that today. And finally, again, knowing how to evaluate what works and what doesn't in a realistic way so that we can be more effective is really important. So I haven't before had the pleasure of meeting our speaker, Bob Williams, but based on his bio and what I've read about his work, I think we're going to hear about all these things, and we're in for a real treat. What I do know is that he was raised in the UK and currently lives in New Zealand. So kind of twice over, he has an excuse for a really cool accent. So you'll get to hear all of that in the speech today. In addition, he's done a lot of, again, organizational, really interesting ecological systemic work. So great background. He also knows quite a bit about Colorado. He is an expert snowboarder, has worked with Paralympics, disability issues in skiing and snowboarding, so you can talk to him about that. I had told him, gosh, it's too bad you're here in October and not November, or in an October where it's not currently snowing, which some Octobers it is, of course, but not this year. But he assures me he knows all about Breckenridge and is even really a good friend of somebody who owns a brewery up there, so I guess he's not missing out on too much, and he'll maybe be back. So without further ado, I am really, really pleased to introduce Bob Williams. Thanks for being here.
Kia ora, thanks very much for the introduction. Before I forget about these things, thanks to the technical crew and the organizers who brought me here, and the technical crew who've helped us sort out a number of interesting issues over the last half hour. I'd also like to apologize a little to some of the people who were around me this morning in the various presentations. It looked as if I was doing all my emails, but actually I was rewriting the presentation. So this will be as much a surprise to you as me, some of these things. So this is a sort of a journey of discovery for all of us, really. The first journey is to see whether this is going to work. Yes. So I want to tackle two issues that seems to have occurred to me and others that I've spoken with that relate to some of the things that I know, and I'll be the first to admit that I know, other than at a domestic level, almost nothing about the areas that is a speciality of yours. These two things. Why don't things actually ever work out the way that we plan? How comes it just doesn't work that way? And the second thing I want to talk about is what we're doing actually worthwhile? And how do we know? Which neatly fits into these two areas of systems ideas and evaluation. So that's quite a nice excuse for these things. Sorry, I'm a bit of a wanderer, so you're just going to have to kind of follow me around. It also helps to keep you guys awake after lunch. So first I want to talk about systems ideas. My first disagreement with the person who introduced me earlier on is there is actually no such thing as systems theory. The history of the systems field goes back a long way. It goes back to the Greeks and the Chinese and others. But the modern systems movement really developed during the, just immediately before and immediately after the Second World War, and has a number of influences. In fact, quite a lot of influences. This diagram was produced by a guy called Ray Eisen, who was the immediate past president of the International Society for Systems Science. And he assured me this morning in an email that this is just a heuristic. This is not the plan of the entire systems field. It's a way of beginning to understand where the ideas from the systems field comes from. But for those of you who can read this particular slide, and my apologies about the quality, on the left-hand side are the sort of intellectual traditions that the systems field today draws upon. Somebody pointed out that psychology is not there. So I asked Ray, and his response was, I don't know. Why don't you ask the psychologists? Anyway, these various ideas coalesced into these sort of big grey blobs that occur immediately to the left of that list. And from that, a number of systems approaches and systems methods have developed. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about them, because I think it is part of the confusion that I'm going to highlight later in this talk that goes on about when we talk about using systems approaches. But first, what I want you to do is to stand up. So has anybody got any idea why I've asked you to stand up, apart from a bit of exercise? I didn't know until about 6 months ago. The origin of the word system is Greek. And one of the translations of the Greek word is to stand together. So you can sit now. You can kind of, you can be unsystemic now. But obviously it has, over the years, developed a whole series of meanings and variations. And I just want to talk a little bit about the extreme right-hand column, because these are basically a list of systems approaches. And most of us come into the systems field or become aware of the systems field through these approaches. And one of the mistakes we often make is that we think that it is the entire field. So some of these things behind you, for those of you who can actually read the thing, is you'll see words like system dynamics. You'll see things like complex adaptive systems. You'll see things like systemic family therapy. You'll see things like soft systems. You'll see things like critical systems. These are all parts of a very large field, like the field that you are in as well. There's a sort of a curious, the way that Ray organized this is kind of curious. And I won't go into too much detail, but there is an element of sort of cultural specificity about the way in which it is ordered. By and large, when I talk to American audiences, you guys are exceptions, but by and large, when I talk to American audiences, their concepts of the systems field tend to be at the top of this diagram and tend not to be aware of all the methods and approaches and methodologies that are available to them from a systemic point of view towards the bottom of the diagram. The reverse is true when I work in the UK. They're not terribly knowledgeable about things like systems engineering. They know a little bit about system dynamics, but they know an awful lot about soft systems, and they know an awful lot about critical systems. When I work in a German context, their system stuff is based off systemic family therapy, with a bit of communications theory thrown into a completely indecipherable branch of the systems field developed by a guy called Luhmann. So there are some interesting cultural issues around this. So it's a big field. I want to be honest, that's the area of the field that I come from, and it's the area of the field that I'm most interested in, and it's also the area of the field that will most influence what I'm going to say over the next 20 minutes or so. However, there are specific systems methodologies that are specifically oriented to the kind of work that you do, other than things like systemic family therapy. There's a guy called Gerald Midgley, another ex-president of the International Society for Systems Science, who's been working a lot in South America, developing something that he calls systemic mediation. And it actually is an extension, quite a complex extension, of the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about. So, you know, even within this broad field, there are people who are specifically using systems ideas and developing specific methodologies that address the specific things that you are specifically interested in. And I'll see if I can stop using the word specific from now on. What has been necessary, however, when introducing people to systems ideas is to simplify them, as was described in the introduction. And when we were trying to use systems ideas in the evaluation field, we realized that it wasn't possible for people to learn all these methods and methodologies. So what we tried to do is say, well, what actually is it that's fundamental about the systems field that we can apply to our own methods and our own approaches that will make them more systemic? To cut a very long story short, that involved 3 days in Berkeley with a bunch of experts in the systems field and experts in the evaluation field, we came up with these 3 concepts that underpin any particular systemic endeavor. The first thing is about understanding interrelationships, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute or two. The next thing is really engaging with multiple perspectives, and it was fascinating listening to the various presentations this morning and a few yesterday about these issues of multiple perspectives. And what I mean by multiple perspectives is not multiple viewpoints of the same perspective, but genuinely different ways of understanding what the heck is going on. And I'll talk a bit about that, about why that's important in terms of understanding why things may not actually work out the way that you think they will. Perhaps a more radical area is this notion of reflecting on boundaries. Every endeavor we do, everything we do, this speech is constrained in some way by a whole series of boundary choices that I'm making, that the organizers make, and the world makes. And unless we reflect on the nature of those particular boundary choices that are made, because mostly they are choices, then we never really quite understand why things happen the way they do. And I'll go into more detail about that in a few minutes. So here's another way of saying the same thing, that the systemic endeavor tries, the action space that goes within it, lies within 3 points of a triangle. There's, and I'm not going to get into constructivist and positivist debates here. By and large, if you want to be technical, the systems field works from a realist paradigm. What is the reality that we're actually dealing with out there? The second thing is, how do we understand what we actually see? Different people will see different things out of that reality and draw different conclusions. That's all very fine, but now we've enlarged the possibilities to an extent that's impossible to handle in practice. Every viewpoint is partial. As I'll show in a minute, there are so many different ways of understanding what you guys are doing. You just cannot, in any way, take into account all of them. It's just not physically possible. So the setting boundaries are making those really tricky decisions about what to leave in and what to leave out. Now, I want to challenge quite a common perception about what systems field's about, or the systemic endeavor is about. Because a lot of the language from the systems field doesn't come from the systems field. It comes from the management field, who took systems ideas about 40 years ago and has never actually checked back to see if they were right. And what you hear from the management field is that holism, very popular phrase at the moment, is about including everything. It's not. You won't hear systems people say that. What you'll hear systems people saying is that holism is about being very smart about choosing what to leave out. Being systemic is about leaving things out, not putting things in. A really, really important point, which raises, as you can imagine, a whole series of practical, social, and ethical and political issues. So, I just want to briefly give you some tools, in a way, of how you might begin to address these three areas so that you understand a little bit better, perhaps, about why things may not work out the way that you want them to. And the first thing is to pose the question, what actually are the key interrelationships in a particular situation that is of interest to you? And here are some questions that you might find useful. And I'll just pause a couple of minutes just to allow you to scan those. Nothing particularly surprising here. But the problem is you end up with something like this. Okay? This is a systems map of a particular situation about pump-based rice production. I couldn't find one that was specifically to do with conflict. And this is one that's in one of my books. It appears to be a relatively simple issue, is that this is in the Sahel area in Mali. And the paddy fields are irrigated by pumps. Pumps wear out. What do you do when pumps wear out in development situation? Well, it's not that easy to work out what you actually do. And this is a kind of picture of the complexity of that apparently simple choice about what do we do about pumps that were supplied by an Australian aid agency 15 years before that have now run out and that have now worn out. Here's another one. I did some work in Lima quite recently, and this is about working with some of the indigenous peoples up in the Cusco area, especially in terms of actually issues to do with conflict resolution in terms of youth. Massively messy. So there's so much going on, and the point is, you can't know it all. So what are the consequences of that? But there's more. On top of all that, on top of all this messy reality, you've got different people's views of what that messy reality is all about. Here's a lovely picture. I love this one to illustrate that point. So what actually are the key perspectives? So what do people see in this diagram? Who sees an old woman? Who sees a young woman? Who sees both? Who are completely confused? The point I make with this one is, without getting into the deep psychology of it all, is that the data is the same. Yet different people see different things. It's fascinating when you throw this up that you get, and then have a break for 5 minutes, which is often what I do, is you get people coming up to the diagram saying, no, it's the woman's chin. You know, it's... So, same data. So, here are some questions that I use to begin to unpick all these multiple ways in which people can actually understand a situation. So, Who actually is affected or is affected by the situation? What roles do they play? What stakes do they have? And how do these stakes, these motivations, these reasons to be in a particular situation, engage with you in a particular project, affect the way they behave? Because unless you know that, you'll have absolutely no idea why things happen the way they do. We all handle things called unanticipated consequences. The point that I want to make at this particular point, and it's a bit of a rhetorical statement, is that there are no such things as unanticipated consequences. Somebody, somewhere, meant it to happen. It just wasn't you. So how do we understand all of that in terms of the dynamics? One of the ways that I do this is to get people to start thinking about finishing this particular phrase. So this way of looking at what the heck is going on is something to do with. I have been spending the morning collecting your something to do withs. And here they are. The one that's fallen off at the bottom is perhaps appropriately truth-telling, which I thought was good. But we cannot take every single point of view into consideration and actually do useful work. It's just not possible. And even if we could, that list could be twice as long. I'm sure some of you were reading that thinking, Bob's missed out X. Of course I have. Every view is partial. Every understanding of reality is partial. So in order to avoid being just like a deer stuck in the headlights, we actually have to start making decisions. We actually have to start making decisions about what we leave in and what we leave out. And in the systems jargon, it's known as boundary decisions. The boundary between what is in and what is out. And this area of the systems field is known as critical systems. And there's a considerable literature around this, but I think it's particularly relevant to the areas that you're in. So here's one way that I help deliberate on that decision. You may still take the same decision, but it enables you to deliberate and reflect on the decisions that inevitably you have to make. And they're based around notions of marginalization. Now, some people don't like the word marginalization. If you don't like the use of the word marginalization and benefits, then try victim, because that's the word the systems field uses. Who or what is victimized by your choices? And how do you respond to that? Because every time you exclude somebody, every time you exclude an issue, you have essentially, and it's a hideously inappropriate phrase to use in these particular circumstances, but within the systems field, within the critical systems field, it's known as victimization. Who benefited, who wins, who loses? Because somebody will always lose, or something will always lose. What are the practical, ethical, and political decisions that flow from that choice that you made to focus on something? To say, that's okay, I'm going to focus on this. This is my shtick. These are my belief systems. This is what I think is important. This is who I think is important. Because it then says something. Well, firstly, you can begin to think through, in practical terms, some tactical responses. It gives you good arguments about why you have chosen, why you choose, but it also gives you a deeper understanding of perhaps why things aren't working out the way you hoped. People who are left out of things tend not to like that. They push back. They tend to delegitimize what you're doing. I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. So you've got to work out how or in what way you're actually going to handle that consciously. You may not change your views, but at least you've got a better argument. Or you may find ways of sweeping in these opposing interests. But fundamentally, it begins to raise value issues, because those boundary choices are based on values. They're based on the way that you see the world. They're not based on technical issues at all. They're based on your beliefs or the people who are involved in those decisions' beliefs. So let's go back to, well, was it worthwhile? Whether it was worthwhile will depend on what you value. Different people will value different things. They will reach different conclusions on whether your choices and your decisions were worthwhile or whether your intervention was worthwhile, depending on their value system and your value system. And this is where evaluation, what you do, and the systems field start to overlap. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about evaluation, since we're now talking about values. What's evaluation? There's a big debate on this. It's another big field. But fundamentally, evaluation is a process by which an assessment is made by a person or a group of people over the merit, the value, the worth, or the significance of a particular intervention or a particular situation. I'm not going to go down into sort of distinctions between those particular words. You get the idea. It's about a value judgment of some description. So that's what fundamentally evaluation is about. Another issue in terms of evaluation that you need to be very clear about is exactly who the client is. It's a tricky word, client, but it's one that's used a lot in evaluation. And very often it's easy to think that you are the client of the evaluation, or the person who funded the intervention that you're involved in is the client of the intervention. But the problem is that's just one way of understanding what the worth of the intervention is. As was talked about in the sessions I was at this morning, there are multiple ways in which people will view what the worth of the intervention is. So what I tend to do in my evaluation work is to say that the intervention is the client. I am trying to get an idea from as many points of view as possible. I've made a boundary choice that I may have to defend, and I may have to do some fancy footwork. Somebody talked about fancy footwork the other day. But this just helps me, that if I keep the focus on what the intervention is, and that's my client, that's to whom I feel accountable to and feel responsible for. And the other area that's really important is understanding the consequences of an evaluation. An evaluation is an intervention. As soon as you start people asking questions about whether something was useful or not, you've intervened in their lives in some way. You've intervened in their particular, you've intervened in their intervention in some kind of way. And there's quite a big movement in the evaluation field away from, oh my God, was it useful? Which I know you ask yourselves as well. Just about every professional endeavor that I know, every craft endeavor I know, worries about the fact that it has all these useful things that nobody ever uses. Much more to thinking about the consequences. And the consequences might be that nobody uses it. So one of the things that I often do is that's where I start in evaluation, is I look at that rich picture. I look at all those different ways of understanding what the thing is about. And one way of allowing me to start defending and drawing those boundaries is to think about what consequences I would like out of an evaluation. So, pulling things together a little. Let's go back to this piece here. And that piece there. Essentially, if you're about to make, or if a group of people are about to make judgments of value or worth, then they've got to be against some kind of criteria. Sustainability, feasibility, efficiency, effectiveness. These sorts of criteria. How well did it do according to these? And what I'm going to take you through now is a set. I'm not a great fan of fixed criteria. In other words, going into a situation with a particular decision on what the various criteria ought to be. A lot of the times they emerge organically and through discussion. But one of the things that I've found using systems ideas, especially critical systems ideas, is that four kind of criteria areas frequently crop up. Around consequences. How valuable were the consequences? Control. Were the various control mechanisms involved worthwhile? I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in a minute. Knowledge, big issue. Heard it lots today. Whose knowledge is honored and whose knowledge is marginalized? Critical boundary choice in any evaluation. And finally, legitimacy. Let me just check what the next slide is. That's completely unhelpful. So I will talk about legitimacy, because I think it's an area that is critical to you, and I think there are areas of the systems field that can really help you in some of the debates and some of the tasks. In fact, I've heard you talking about some of these things before. But one of the fundamental tenets of this particular area of the systems field is that an intervention, a system, cannot legitimize itself. Only those who are negatively affected by an intervention, by your intervention, can legitimize that particular intervention. I've had so many arguments with people over this one. So I'll give you a very simple example. Trivial, I apologize. And I could give you much more complicated ones. But think cycle lanes. Cyclists cannot legitimize cycle lanes. Only motorists and pedestrians can legitimize cycle lanes. People who attended my workshop will be familiar with what I'm about to say next. I've lived the last 5 months or so in Lima. Lima has just been voted as having the worst traffic in the world. I have a friend who spends 5 hours a day commuting 10 kilometers between his university. 5 hours a day. It's a car park. And in the middle of this car park, or what do they call it here? I've forgotten. Thank you. Parking lot. It's a parking lot. In the middle of this parking lot, the city council has taken 1/3 of the road area for bicycles. Right? It only takes 2 cars or a pedestrian like me to use the cycling lane because the sidewalks are so crowded. Right? So it's only the pedestrians and the car users, those who are negatively affected by 1/3 of the road being taken away, that can legitimize that. And I can go into kind of various details about there is a practical legitimacy, you just park your car somewhere. There is the political legitimacy, happened in Wellington quite recently, my hometown, where the objections to a particular cycle lane were so much that we were so close to a local authority election that the politicians basically changed the law. There was a political response by those in power. And then there's a social good. What right have cyclists got to have priority over other means of transport? What's the sort of social, ethical value that underpins all of that? So this is the area of legitimacy that is part of the evaluation scene. So here's how I've gone through that. Let's just go to here. So here are some criteria and some evaluation questions, some generic, it's a heuristic, some generic evaluation questions that handle that. It's a long list, I apologize. But it essentially is, well, how appropriate were the purposes? Purposes, remember, there are lots of different purposes out there. How appropriate were they? How significant were the benefits to those who were intended to benefit? There's quite a bit of a debate within the evaluation field, is of course if you're evaluating a project and you see somebody really engaged in the project and think it's great, then you go and look at the rest of their lives and realize that, frankly, didn't matter a great deal. Very successful project. In the grand scheme of things, just a tiny part of somebody's life. To what extent did they benefit? Now, those two examples I've given also relate to, well, how do you actually know? What means do you actually begin to assess that benefit? Benefit in relation to the goals of the project, or benefit in relation to the relevance to their general lives? It's a tricky decision. Control. There are people who have to manage resources for any intervention. But in most cases, so that to ensure that the beneficiaries benefit, rather than people maintaining their own motivations, people are involved in projects for many different reasons, give them lots of money, and they'll work to their reason, not yours. So there are some control mechanisms that any intervention has. How do you decide where that is? How clever, how smart was that distinction between those who control the resources and those who manage them? Now, I worked until recently for a very, 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 very large foundation in the United States that was fascinated by that question. Because they realized if their granting processes were too tight, they didn't end up with the innovation that they wanted. But at the same time, if they were too loose, then it may well be that people would say, look, frankly, we're not interested in your purposes, these are the purposes that we're interested in. Where's the appropriate, how well was that managed? And then, of course, there are some natural constraints, time and people, skills, resources. How well were those particular things managed in order to ensure that the beneficiaries benefited? Knowledge. Whose knowledge? I work for a Japanese organization that has, by its regulations within that, to work in a transdisciplinary way. And one of the definitions of transdisciplinarity is that these scientists, it's called the Institute for Environment and Humanity, it's a bunch of scientists, a bunch of pretty hardcore scientists. But their responsibility is to use other knowledge systems other than science. So they're struggling with that. And they're keeping on monitoring. How well did, and part of my job to help them is to evaluate, well, how well did they actually do that? How did they check that they were using the right kind of information at the right kind of time? Big issue in New Zealand and in this part of the world and in other areas around indigenous knowledge, for instance. I mean, that's the simple example. And we've already talked about legitimacy. If 12 questions are too many, here's 4 of them. It's just basically a simplification of what it was. So that's evaluation. So let me just kind of very quickly recap what we've got. We've got a systems approach which is really big. We've got people who actually do use systems approaches on conflict resolution. Go find them. They know a lot about the application of systems ideas to conflict resolution, conflict intervention, trauma, and stuff like that. There are people in the family systems therapy area, and there are also people in the critical systems area as well. 3 things to kind of hang off and ask yourself as you are intervening. How well do I know the interrelationships? What am I doing about finding out what the multiple perspectives are? And how reflective am I, or what reflective processes are there on the inevitable boundary decisions that I make to focus on one thing rather than another? 12 questions to help you. 11. It varies. Sometimes there are 13. I've tried to word them to make them a bit more relevant to you guys, but about a dozen questions will get you there pretty well. In terms of evaluation, don't forget, it is about the judgment of merit, value, and worth according to criteria, and from that, questions arise. Evaluative questions. What's it worth type questions. Not whether things happened, but were they worthwhile. A focus on consequences. Think about the consequences of any evaluative approach. Think about the consequences of your intervention, for that matter. And then these 4 key evaluation criteria flowing from a particular area of the systems field known as critical systems heuristics. These criteria are in addition to, not replacing, other criteria that you might think relevant in terms of your particular piece of work. And then a bunch of possible evaluation questions. So I've got about another 10 minutes of talking, and then I'll leave it open to questions. People often say, oh, this is all very interesting stuff, but what do I do? And here's my reply. And I'll talk about where some of these ideas came from, because they don't just come from experience. One of them is probably less with you guys, but quite substantially with more traditional evaluation, is that it will actually affect your relationships with some key players, key stakeholders. I mean, I know that the stakeholder word here can be problematic at times, but you kind of get the sense. Especially the people who are really convinced that their idea is the best idea. Their approach is the best approach. It's our money that's supplying you. This is what we want out of this particular situation. It can affect that relationship, and you have to be prepared for that. So, start with an area that interests you, because you're more likely to develop skills and abilities in that area. You don't have to use it all. If any of the ideas that I've suggested over the last 3/4 of an hour or so strike a chord, work from there. Work outwards. This is not a linear idea. It's something more organic that you can work out from. If areas particular areas attract you, then work out from there. Use it when it's going to be useful. And I know this is an area that you're concerned about in your particular issue, and your particular focus is, are we using these methods all the time, in the right place, for the right reason? It's the same with the use of systems ideas. Use it in a safe place. In my introduction, there was this mention that I have some experience in the educational field when it relates to snowboarding and skiing and working with people with disabilities. I'm actually quite a good snowboarder. I'm a reasonably good skier. When I am trying something new, I go back to the beginner's area. When I'm teaching somebody new, I take them back to the beginner's area. It's not always easy. That's where you learn new techniques, somewhere where it's relatively safe. All right? I'm not trying to teach someone to do a backside 360 off a jump that's 35 feet high. It's going to hurt. All right? There are generally people somewhere who are interested in those ideas, and that gives you the kind of safe place. And finally, don't be a purist. Some of the ideas that I've presented, the originators of those ideas might be just slightly uncomfortable with some of the ways that I've played around with their ideas. But there again, their ideas made other people uncomfortable too. We all stand on each other's shoulders in this particular area. So just play around and have some fun. And with that, I'll allow you to have some fun with me. Thank you very much.
So I know that one of the issues within, I guess I can't say systems theory, a systems approach, can I say that? Systems thinking, is that you have to be adaptive. I think a lot of times in the work that we all do, we get into the field and we find that conditions are different from the ones that we planned for, and we have to adapt. So I'm wondering if you could give an example of a time, maybe you were evaluating someone else's project or intervention, but where things went terribly wrong and they were able to gather what they needed to then adjust and hopefully maybe make things go better. But so the use of, I guess the use of evaluation and also being, maybe even knowing that things are going wrong is half of it. It's not a very well-formed question, but.
I mean, like all good interviewers, I'm going to answer the question that I really want to answer rather than the one that you've just posed. But I think it broadens out your concept a little. There was a particular piece of work that I was doing a number of years ago around the activities of indigenous organizations that were receiving government money to provide social services. And it was a pilot program. There was some dissatisfaction that the quality of the management of these particular projects was not really up to scratch, and that government money was being wasted or misused. So they set up a pilot training program. And because it was a pilot training program, pilots are terrible things to evaluate because they're so unreal. And one of the aspects of this pilot program was that rather than going organization by organization by organization, they grouped a whole bunch of organizations together, put them through a management training, and our job was to come along and judge whether that training was worthwhile. Okay? So it was a successful project. That's what we found out. However, because we applied multiple perspectives, so we evaluated it not only, we did a bit of scoping to find out, okay guys, what are the different ways of understanding what this particular intervention is all about? And we ended up with about 5 or 6. It was quite an important list. And one of them we discovered was if we thought about this intervention from a networking perspective, then that explained substantially why the training perspective was successful. Now think about this. This was a pilot project. The original idea was then to go out to the various organizations, of which there were about 150, and to give them individual training. But actually, it would fail. Because what we discovered, using a different set of lenses, is that people were also there because of the networking ability. And as a consequence of that networking ability, people discovered that the situation wasn't actually as bad as everybody thought it was. That actually one of the reasons why it was thought it was bad was that different organizations were bad-mouthing each other, and that got back to the politicians, who panicked, right, and decided that money wasn't being well spent. So although this didn't sort out, it kind of headed off a particular issue, that we could then go back and say, look, you need to think about this project through at least two sets of lenses. One of them is basic management skills, which were needed, no doubt about that, but also as a networking project as well. And if you design the full intervention with those two perspectives, and there were a couple of others as well, you'll end up with something which is legitimate, is controllable, is using the right level of expertise and knowledge, and will actually benefit the people that you're actually intending to benefit. So I'm answering a broader question, but that's an example of how we headed off a problem rather than trying to sort out the mess after it happened. There is a branch of evaluation that's developed recently called developmental evaluation. I mean, if you think of evaluation a bit like that systems thing with a long list of different methodologies, that has a sort of an action research, a strong action research element to it, which is specifically designed to be much more involved in the management of a project than has traditionally been the case in much evaluation. You're literally sitting around at the decision-making table, bringing evaluative results as they happen. Sort of fast turnaround evaluation. So that's a particular methodology that's been around for about a decade now and is developing a significant following. And in fact, there's just been a number of books. If people are interested in that, there are a number of books that have just been published. And there's some very good resources on the net for that as well.
Thank you. This has been a good presentation of a complex issue. I'm wondering, in intervention strategies, when you're mapping, you're doing systems mapping, where do you, the intervener, place yourself on that map, or should you place yourself on that map?
My response is actually one step back from that, which is that you put yourself in that map. You'll be amazed the number of people who don't even make that step. So where is a kind of, a far out question. And I find that particularly the case when I work with interventions that are funded by a single source. And I go back to that single source funding and I say, essentially, okay, you've asked me to do an evaluation of Project X, so I'm going to start asking questions of you, the funder. And they go, why? And I said, because you're part of the intervention. You're part of that map. And you would be amazed how surprised people are about that. So one of the advantages of mapping processes, and the systems field has many different mapping processes for different stages of intervention and for different purposes. There's a really good resource on the Open University's, an Open University website that I can refer you to about a whole range of different mapping approaches. Some of you will be very familiar with, like mind mapping and things like that. But yes, you'd be amazed. And one of the ways of doing that is to use the mapping process where it becomes kind of obvious that the funding agency or the initiating agency or you as the evaluator, if what you're doing is the evaluation process, fit in this picture? So it's actually quite a good way, rather than sitting down in front of the CEO saying, I'm going to ask you some really tough questions about the balance between management and control, for instance. They'll really, but put them through a mapping process and you'd be amazed how much more easy it is. Good question. Important question.
Thank you, first of all, very much for giving the opportunity for this deep thought. We have a project here in Colorado called Conflict Resolution Month in Colorado. And as Tamara knows, we've been working on evaluation for some years. And one of the things that you brought out was who's the client. And you're suggesting the client is the intervention itself. So if you could help us discern, is the client the citizenry of our state who we hope to help see a different way of dealing with conflict, or is it our program, the campaign, Conflict Resolution Month in Colorado?
Wow, that's a good question. I'll answer it in a couple of stages. The first thing is that for me, it's a rhetorical device, because it allows me to go to people and say, if the intervention is the client, how many different ways of assessing the worth are going to be around? Do you understand? I mean, it is purely, in some ways, a rhetorical device. It frees me up to enable even the points that you've raised to be raised. Okay? So that's the first stage. In terms of the second stage, I think it depends on those boundary choices that you make. And once you've made those boundary choices, I've never had to think about this before. This is really good. Once you've made those boundary choices, I would argue that then becomes the client. All right. So it's a sort of it's a bit like a funneling process in a way, that you start off with the client being the entire situation, right? And all these multiple ways of understanding it, but in the end, you're going to have to do some real stuff with the resources you've got and the time you've got. So what the client is, if you buy my argument, the client shifts and narrows down. That's a really good. I'd never ever thought about that before. But in the design process, your notion of the client will narrow and shift. In some of the other, when I do sort of evaluation training, I get people to distinguish between focus and scope. Right? So what's the soup that a particular evaluation or a particular intervention floats in that you have to kind of keep an eye on in order for it to make sense? Context is the word that's sometimes used. And to repeat myself, I think what you do is you start off with the scope being the client, but you end up with the focus being the client. But you then obviously have to still defend or accommodate the consequences of that choice. Great question. I'd never thought of that before. Thank you.
We're just going to have a conversation about Conflict Resolution Month in Colorado. So would you put back up the slide?
Yep, which one?
Where next?
That one?
No,
Or the one that follows?
where next? That. So that really hit home for this particular project, in that it has changed relationship with key stakeholders. Going in, those of us who are enthusiasts thought that everybody ought to be enthusiasts because this was such an important thing to do in the state of Colorado. Well, guess what? Not everybody's real interested. How many people in this room who are from Colorado ever heard of this project? So, there you see it. And then we have a very unusual, and not unheard of, but unusual mechanism that we use that starts with do whatever you're already doing, number 2, that you're interested in that would help meet this goal of helping people solve problems in the state, in their homes or businesses or whatever. And then if you go down this list, I think we're right on track. And I'm still not sure who the client is. If it's the focus, and so we've adopted this, and I'm just really glad to see it explained that way. Everybody is involved by volunteering. They're all doing what makes sense to them. But then how do you evaluate the use of those resources, and will it ever really make a difference? I guess, why are we doing it in the first place?
Yeah, and I think I mean, I use the word client because that's the word that evaluators use. Actually, I think focus is probably a better way of, for you, it's about changing focus as much as who's the client. It's that continual search and reassessment about what the focus is. And from the branch of the systems field that I come from and the branch of the evaluation field that I come from, one of the joining points of that will be that the focus will inevitably shift as the circumstances shift. And that, from a design point of view, and the sort of boundary choices you have to make about the use of resources and the use of knowledge, is a toughie, and requires, I think, the adoption of some quite new skills within the evaluation field that I think we're only just learning.
I just want to thank Mary for bringing this example up, because I think it helps to have an example like this. And because I do know a little bit about this particular case, I'd like to actually highlight one thing that I have found really helpful in your work and the work that you've presented to us, and that's the notion of defining your boundaries. And I guess I would push us, and I put myself in that category as well, that are involved with conflict resolution within Colorado, to define what our boundaries are. Maybe you can help us ask that question.
Well, some of those questions will ask that, in the sense that the boundary questions that are hidden in those 12 questions are all about what is in and what is out. So who benefits, who doesn't? How do we know is a boundary choice. You know, I mean, at the simplest level, it's the qualitative-quantitative debate, or it's about the monitoring debates that go on, but it's deeper than that. You know, who ought to have control and who ought to... I mean, one of the fascinating ideas is this notion, from this, is this notion that a particular intervention should not have infinite resources, because the managers, in inverted commas, the managers of an intervention should not have unlimited resources, because then there is no guarantee that their interests won't be served rather than the beneficiaries' interests. Because as we've said, you know, we're all in various projects for various reasons. We're all at this conference for completely different reasons. And the way we behave will be that. I mean, good managers know this. I used to run an NGO to do with HIV/AIDS, and I used a lot of volunteers. And the first question I'd ask them is, why are you wanting to volunteer? And the first response would be, because I want to reduce the transmission of HIV/AIDS. And I would say, no, you don't. I think you just need a CV for a new job. I think that you may be feeling a bit guilty that your closest friend, this is a long time ago, died of AIDS and you didn't feel that you put enough help and support. All right? I wouldn't say I think. I would be pushing people. And then when they would resist this, I would say, look, you have to remember that I cannot manage you unless I understand why you're here. So be honest about that. Then I can make you do useful stuff that will help achieve your objectives rather than my objectives. But if I didn't ask those questions and just let people do their stuff, then you would end up with a situation which we actually did end up with in this particular organization, of being a volunteer organization with an HIV project hanging off the end, that satisfying the needs of the volunteers in the end dominated our work rather than the work that we were supposed to do. And that was because we were given the freedom to basically do what we wanted to do. There wasn't this sort of, you've got to kind of defend your boundary. And that was one of the sort of management interventions that I found in order to work this through, is to get people to talk about their motivations so that I could set some boundaries around things. So it is about this area of understanding where those boundary choices are. Now, the philosophical underpinnings of what I've talked about argue two things. One of them is that in the process of deliberating on boundaries, I'll step one back. The idea is to pose the question, is this the right thing to do? That's the thing that drives philosophically the things that I showed up. The ideas developed by C. West Churchman at Stanford University 40-odd years ago. He was a professor of management, and especially the professor of management of science. And this was in the 50s and the 60s, when science was unquestionably the right thing to do, right? The 70s and the 80s hadn't happened yet. And he was one of the early people who came along and said, how do we know that this is the right thing to do? And his response was twofold. By addressing boundary issues, you could, with people who were your enemies. His second book was called A Systems Approach and Its Enemies. That unless you engage with your enemies, you would never be able to develop an adequate argument for the world as a whole about why this is the right thing to do. So you don't necessarily change what you do. You don't necessarily move the boundary, but you've developed a much better argument with those who are on the other side of the boundary. The second reason is that he had this notion of called sweeping, I'll go back a bit. He had this notion of sweeping in. And what he's saying is that we do have limited resources, but if we are seeking to gain legitimacy, we may have to sweep in the interests of those who oppose us in some way, or those who are on the margins. Gerald Midgley talks a lot about, the boundary isn't a kind of thick thing. It's sort of, there are people at one end of the boundary and the other end. There are people who sort of are relatively unhappy with what you're doing and people who absolutely loathe it, and how you manage that particular boundary. That's a lot of what Gerald, the papers that I put up earlier on, that's a lot of what Gerald's work is involved in, is managing the width of the boundary rather than the boundary itself. But this notion of sweeping in is based on the idea that you enter a particular endeavor with a particular framing in mind. And that by sweeping in some of the arguments of the enemy, you may reframe. You may reframe a project in ways that it actually changes things so much that the issues become non-existent. And I'll give you a very quick example, because I guess you're about to do the wrap-up. And it, at one level, sounds a trivial example, but actually it's not. There's a very famous systems guy called Russ Ackoff, American guy. spent a lot of his time in the private sector. One of his major clients was Caterpillar, the construction firm. And they came to him and said, we have an industrial relations problem. So their framing was an industrial relations problem. They had to fire people and hire people, and fire people and hire people. And it was a unionized site, a unionized organization. And he went out and had a look around and looked at the situation and said, you will never solve this issue, the enemy being the trade union, and the workers who are actually being laid off, if you keep thinking of it as an industrial relations issue. I will suggest that if you think of it as a product cycle issue, you will resolve your problem. All right? And the reason why he suggested that is that the reason why there was the hiring and the firing was that civil engineering is counter-cyclical economically, right? This is Keynesian days. So that when the economy was down, roads got built. So it was a good time for Caterpillar when the economy was down. When the economy picked up again, they had to fire people. So his argument was, can you think of a product? Think of it as a product issue. Can you think of a product which is counter-cyclical? And they did. They went away, came up, and in fact, it was one of the most profitable things that Caterpillar ever did. And incidentally, it also solved their industrial relations issue. So this was a question of sweeping in the enemy in a way that actually resolved the primary issue, as well as generating other ways of doing things. So these two things that you do, one of them is enhance your own particular argument about this is the right thing to do, and the other one is seek the possibility of ways of incorporating other viewpoints whilst still maintaining that boundary. You still don't have enough. It's not a question of expanding out and including everybody in and kumbaya. It's keeping the boundaries that we have, maybe changing them and altering them and mixing them around. But you still have the same amount of resources, you still have the same amount of skills. But can we think of the project in a different way that allows us to incorporate and increase the legitimacy of what we're doing?
So very thought-provoking talk, very creative, and we appreciate all the wisdom you've shared with us. Please join me in thanking our speaker.